internally we wanted to start at 6:40, and it's 6:39. So I just wanted to say, so thank you for your patience in getting signed in. Welcome to, I think we have 2 history classes here from Medgar, so thank you to those students. Yes, that's clap-worthy. But you all look great. I want to welcome you. I am April Silver. I work with the Center for Black Literature here at MedgarEversCollege. I'm also representing myself at Killer Work Songs and doing this program. This has been a labor of love. We wanted to share and have a public gathering. So on behalf of the Center for Black Literature, on behalf of the Black History Month Committee here at MedgarEversCollege, and on behalf of Akira Work Songs as well, and just on behalf of everybody who cares about the health of our community, and those on behalf of the positive energies that are surrounding us, we just want to say welcome. We are going to have an amazing program. We have a couple of things lined up. I promise you toward the end there will be an opportunity for you, the community at large, to ask questions. I just need to get a couple of house cleaning things out the way, if you don't mind. We are at full capacity. Well, I think there are like 2 seats left, so we're very, very happy about that. One of the things I want to say first, if you don't mind, before we get into some of the nuts and bolts, is many of you are producers in the community. You've done events, you've worked with people outside of yourselves, and you've done producing, and so you know what it's like, I'm sure, many of you, that when you're presenting or doing an event, it's so easy to get caught up in the logistics. It's so easy to get caught up in the nuts and bolts. And it is an important thing to remind yourself, or I'm sure you would agree, about why we're doing this work in the first place, right? Why it's important and why it has value. So part of what that was for us as a collective was to remember that we are here to pay homage to our ancestors. We are here to tap into that energy of perseverance, of love, of black on black love, and that is one of the core fundamental reasons why we're here, so that the work and the lives and the mission and the prayers of our ancestors are not forgotten, that we stay in alignment with that, that we stay on the course that is toward the improvement of our lot here in this particular country. And some people question the value of why, as a matter of fact, a member of the press said to me, April, at some point we're all the descendants of Harriet Tubman, we're all the descendants of Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, so they didn't immediately see the value of why this should be covered, in their particular outlet. Until I finished talking, and then they got it. So I give thanks for that. But I just want to lift up the reason why we are here to tap into that positive energy, to make sure that the chain is not broken. So just to set that foundation. And very specifically, we want to say thank you to Baba Lloyd Weaver, who is our special guest, who's sitting right here, yes. Thank you for your willingness to continue this conversation, to make sure that we're clear about the legacy of Frederick Douglass. We're very much looking forward to the insights, the things that nobody else knows, that you can share with us as a source of inspiration as we move forward in doing all that we can to make sure that we are on the right path and steadily focused on our liberation. So thank you, Baba Lloyd. We're definitely going to get to that in a second. I want to remind people you can feel free to record. Feel free. We have some video recording going on. I just would ask that your phone, put it on mute or vibrate or something. We just don't want to hear it ringing. You can record, feel free. On your program, you can see the hashtags, you can see the social media handles for those who are on social media, but just make sure that your phone is turned off or that is turned down. So that's one housekeeping note that I wanted to give. You should have, just to be clear, you should have a program here that gives the flow of the event. But there's another piece of information I really wanted people to have, which is about the lineage. If you don't have it, we'll make sure you get it before you go. But this two-sided document is, there's no total, this one is just, sorry, it's just black and white. This gives the lineage. This is directly and approved by Barbara Lloyd. What is the connectivity between Barbara Lloyd and Frederick Douglass? So that document is for your edification as well. I wanted to make sure that you all have that. As I said, this event is on behalf of the Center for Black Literature and the Keeler Work Songs. I want to thank you, Dr. Green, for honoring my vision to make this happen. I've talked to a number of people across the country. You were the first to say, yes, we have to do this, to pay homage. So I thank you, and we're going to introduce you to the audience a little bit later. But at this point, I'd like to bring up Clarence Reynolds, who is the director of the Center for Black Literature, to give you all a sense of what the center does, the connection to the community. So if we could please welcome Clarence Reynolds to the mic.
Good evening, everyone. Wow. I'm really excited to see everyone here. Thank you so much for coming out. To April and Dr. Green, you both know what that means. Yes. What a great job. What a great job. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Center for Black Literature. We've been established here at MedgarEversCollege since 2003. The Center for Black Literature produces several literary programs for the college and also for the community and also for the general public. Our main program is coming up, if you haven't gotten one already, outside, our 14th National Black Writers Conference. It's going to be a fantastic program. The theme is Gathering Up the Waters, and we're talking about literature that focuses on healing, nurturing, and activism. Our honorees are going to be, they're listed here. I'm not going to read over one, but I think everyone has one of these. You should have gotten them. But please do come up. We have workshops, we have films, we have poetry readings, we have award ceremony. It's going to be a wonderful event. Several of our other programs, we have our Being Vision Allies Literature program, is our program that we do with high school and elementary school students. We have an elders writing program, and the elders are, we're in collaboration with Solemn Presbyterian Church, and the ladies, I just finished reading their work. They're coming up with their 4th anthology, which will be out and available at the National Black Writers Conference, and it's wonderful. So I just wanted to tell everyone I appreciate you coming out. I'm really happy that you do come out. We're all here because this is a labor of love, believe me, and I can feel it and see it in the room. And I'm just happy to. I'm happy to see everybody. I really am happy to see everybody. So thank you so much.
Family, that Clarence is a labor horse, and his head is always buried in the work, Saturday, Sunday, Monday through Friday doing this work. And then sometimes you look up and then you have a room full of people. So that's his excitement. So we thank you very much on behalf of the center. I'm not going to go into Aquila Work Songs. On the program it says we're going to talk about the co-presenters. I will not do that, except to say that we are celebrating 25 years this year. And thank you. I'll leave it at that. I want to introduce now the special guest, not the special guest, but Herb Boyd is going to give some commentary to kick the program off. You will see that a little bit of his bio is on the back for those who may not be familiar, but I suspect that this audience kind of knows who Herb Boyd is, for sure. We have been talking for, it's got to be 20 years now about working together, so that's a little joke between us. So I would say, Mr. Boyd, that this is the kickoff for that, I would say. So I want to remind you, in case you didn't see when you came in, his book, Black Detroit, is actually on sale. The bookstore was a little bit late in getting here, but it is the book that is on sale. It's award-winning, it's phenomenal. I would encourage you, you can get it signed after this, right before the reception. So on that note, I would ask that you would read his bio on the back of your program. And then next, can we please welcome him to the stage to give us some context about this bicentennial of Frederick Douglass. Please welcome to the mic, Mr. Herb.
Finally with April. Oh, I've been after her for years, and this is our debut. This is in the People's Republic of Brooklyn. What a place to debut, right? Power concedes to nothing without a demand. Never did, never will. Many of us know that particular speech from Frederick Douglass. One of the things that struck me about this opportunity to be with Lloyd Weaver is that for many years I've taught at the College of New Rochelle, City College, Wayne State University, the University of Iowa, but it's been the University of the Streets in which I've had the best exchanges. And always with opportunities like this, I meet so many of my former students from the streets. And they remind me of our times together. In fact, one of the students that I remember probably most fervently is one, well, I was delivering a lecture one time, a very, I thought, impassioned lecture on Frederick Douglass. The student's hand went up. I said, right in the middle of my lecture, interrupt me. Professor Boyd, did you know Frederick Douglass? I thought it had something to do with how passionate I was speaking to him about Douglass. Nothing to do with the possibility I might have been the same age. The bicentennial is a remarkable time to reflect on an American icon and to share this opportunity, with Lloyd Weaver. I have something now and fresh and new that I can say to my students. Oh no, I didn't know Frederick Douglass, but I knew his great-great-grandson. In fact, I shared a very, very momentous occasion with him in Brooklyn. And it's ironic that we're meeting here at this time talking about Frederick Douglass. A couple of weeks ago, I opened up the New York Times, and there was an article by Sam Roberts, one of the most outstanding journalists we've had in this country. And he's always aware and attuned. You know what I'm saying, Richard? Always attuned to what's happening with books about New York. And so this particular Sunday, he was talking about a book called Frederick Douglass in Brooklyn. I said, wait a minute. That's just so propitious. I think that's the opportunity that I need. I was not aware how often Frederick Douglass spoke in Brooklyn. But Professor Theodore Ham has put together a remarkable book. If you don't get Black Detroit, pick up Theodore Ham's book. I think it's a remarkable study of the association, the connection of Frederick Douglass with this community. I didn't realize he must have spoken here at least more than a dozen times. Professor Ham points out at least 8 occasions. The 2 most important for me is when he spoke here commemorating Abraham Lincoln's birthday, February the 14th, 1893. on that occasion, it was like one of those after-dinner speeches, right? And Frederick was never very fond of these after-dinner speeches. Although on this occasion, he accepted, and particularly when they started talking about, Blue Point oysters and cigars and all other kinds of amenities, he said, okay, that's fine, we can do that. But he hurried through that speech. And this was going to be one of the most important speeches that he would ever deliver about his association with Abraham Lincoln. He said that they had a personal and a peculiar relationship. I was thinking about that just the other day with the death of Lerone Bennett and the work that he had done on Abraham Lincoln. But it stands in stark contrast to the kind of reflections, the remembrances that Frederick Douglass had. Of course, he had a personal one. He met with him in 1863 for the first time. The other important date that he had was talking about John Brown and meeting John Brown here in Brooklyn, as he had met him in Detroit, just before John Brown struck out against Harper's Ferry's arsenal in 1859. And many people feel that that particular moment, however unsuccessful it may have been for Brown and his colleagues, it sparked the Civil War. And that's something that Douglass remarked on when he spoke, about John Brown here in Brooklyn. And then he talked about all of the different abolitionists that was here in this community. And believe me, Brooklyn had its share of remarkable abolitionists. A lot of people, when they start talking about slavery, they kind of confine it to below the cotton curtain. But it was a whole lot of slavery above the cotton curtain. We call it up south. In fact, David Ruggles, the great abolitionist, he called New York, the savannah of the North. At one time, there were more slaves here in New York than there was in the Carolinas. So the abolitionist movement is almost inseparably connected, to the whole rise of slavery in this country. And it's Philadelphia, Boston, and certainly in Detroit. We had the whole history of slavery there and a number of significant abolitionists who rose up against it. But here, Douglass, here he is, here in New York, commenting on the abolitionists and congratulating them. J.W.C. Pennington, the fugitive blacksmith. He, for the most part, he operated out of Manhattan along with David Ruggles. But he had a house right here in Brooklyn. In fact, later on, his house was bought by Truman Capote, the writer. And J.W.C., they called him the fugitive blacksmith because he was one of those runaway slaves who was able to get outside that plantation and began to speak truth to power in an outstanding slave narrative. Of course, when you talk about slave narratives, you can't get past Frederick Douglass on that. Here's a man who lived long enough to write 3 autobiographies. What I'm going to do is kind of spare you on a lot of the kind of details and the resume of Frederick Douglass. I'm going to leave that for his great-great-grandson to do. And I think that's all the more apropos, to have someone who can speak in a very, very intimate way about what that man meant, not only to this country or to his family, but also to the whole world, because you're talking about an international figure that he was. Frederick Douglass spoke here 2 years before his death, February 14th, 1893. Professor Ham notes that that's Lincoln's birthday, but he could have noted it was also Douglass's birthday. And we're talking about 200 years now So when he's speaking there, and 2 years later, he's gone. You know, I'm here in Brooklyn. Maybe 2 years from now, I'm hoping I'm still around. And certainly, in that Blue Point oysters, you can go ahead and bring that dinner on out. You know, we love to have that opportunity. Douglas did not get it at that time. He was not that interested in it. He was more interested in talking about the mounting fire, the fuel in that fire that was burning in this country, about the abolition of slavery. And Douglas, you know, when the whole war was developing, he began to go out there and recruit blacks to fight, you know, in the Civil War. Men of color to arms, he said. And his voice, you know, gave the kind of resonance and the kind of passion that he brought to that struggle. And black men across the country began to line up to fight. Because before that, Abraham Lincoln was not that interested in having black troops in the war. He said, this is a white man's struggle. Nothing to do with you. In fact, we even almost dismissed the notion that had anything to do with slavery. That if anything, I'm trying to hold the Union together. That's the foremost thing on my mind. But when the Battle of Antietam was an opportunity for him, for Lincoln, to change his mind, he had tried to write the Emancipation Proclamation on 2 occasions and kind of backed off of it. But then finally he got around to doing it after the Union forces had been taking serious defeats from the Confederates. They finally won a battle. So now he can feel like, okay, I can bring these black troops in, so it won't look like they're coming to our rescue. But we know historically that the African-American soldier has been almost indispensable to any kind of struggle and war we've had in this country. All the way back to Crispus Attucks. You take it all the way back to the Revolutionary War. You take it through the Battle of 1812. You take it to the Civil War. You take it to the Korean War, World War II, the Vietnam War. We were always there. So it was not unusual then that we find them, you know, on the front line, you know, during the Civil War. And Douglas was out there recruiting on a daily basis. And one of the things about Frederick Douglass is that, you know, it's hard to talk about a man of such enormous integrity, unimpeachable integrity. There's no way in the world we can do justice to him, you know, in the time we have allotted this evening. My recommendation is that one of the books you want to pick up is the one he did in 1845, his first slave narrative, The Narrative of My Life. And then maybe get the other 2. And then get some very fine biographers out there, William McFeely, and certainly what Theodore Ham has talked about in the number of occasions that Douglas lent his voice to the struggle here. He didn't have an opportunity to speak that much longer after the 1893 event, but his voice continues to echo across the ages. You cannot talk about the July the 4th speech that he delivered. The hypocrisy in this country, he talked about it in that context. You can talk about the kind of statesman that he was in terms of dealing with Haiti, the Dominican Republic, talking about the whole Caribbean basin. He was a knowledgeable internationalist long before a lot of the people came to respect that. And Malcolm X, you know, of course, brought it home to us in a very, very strong way, you know, a century later. But Douglas sets the format, the whole premise in terms of struggle, revolutionary struggle and activism in this country. You have to go back and review the substance of the kind of rhetoric that he delivered right here in Brooklyn. And what he said at that time, you have nothing to lose but your chains. You have to go ahead and break loose. A lot of people used to compare him even with Karl Marx. in terms of kind of revolutionary attitude that he had at some point. But more than anything, let's keep in mind that the legacy of Frederick Douglass and the importance not only he had for the world, but certainly right here in Brooklyn. Reflect on that as we listen to the conversation between Lloyd Weaver and Dr. Brenda Green. Thank you very much.
Can we thank Mr. Boyd again for that wonderful context? We were in reference to him, that we will be in good hands. Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. We have a number of people who have come in after we started, so I just want to say a couple of things. Thank you for your endurance. Some of you are sitting on the floor and standing in the back. I promise you it will be worth your patience. So thank you to everybody. Thank you for this full house. What I didn't say before, family, is that afterwards, after this program is over, there will be a reception, a free reception where there will be some light, I was looking for Clarence, just some light refreshments. You're welcome to partake after this is over. The Medgar is one of the few places you can go and have a historic event like this, and then it's free and open to the community, and we feed you. That's a good thing. So we encourage you to buy books. The Greenlight Bookstore has set up outside as well. We want to remind people to turn off their phones as well, and there will be an opportunity for people to ask questions at the end of the conversation. So I want to bring on next, I'm not going to read the bios here of Dr. Brenda Green, but I will just highlight that she is the Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature, the co-presenter of this event. And I'm going to leave you to read the bio of our special guest of honor, Mr. Lloyd Weaver, but I just want to say there are people in this room who can speak very eloquently about the value that Lloyd Weaver brings to our community, way better than I, so I will not even attempt to do so. I will simply say that I think it was a year ago, Mabah, where we spoke, and you humbly mentioned in that conversation, after so many people talked about us connecting, that you were the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and you said it so casually, I lost my breath. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I remember you saying that you grew up with your family traveling at least across the region and beyond, particularly during the 4th of July, at special events for the state of New York and Washington, D.C., at the White House, where your family would be present to represent that particular lineage. And I know you will talk about, because we're very interested to hear about your travels. And I just want to say, I'm sure on behalf of the community at large, that we're very happy that you decided to come back and talk about this lineage, to talk about the things that we don't know, to talk about the things that only you can share of our very great and powerful ancestor. So we give homage to you and give respect to you for that decision to come back. And I know you have 24 pages of notes. I know you have a lot of notes. We're going to have a great opportunity for you to share all of the wisdom that's in your head and your heart. And so at this point, I just want to ask the community if we could welcome Baba Lloyd Weaver to the stage for this conversation, and also welcome
So greetings on behalf of the Center for Black Literature again. It is such a pleasure to have all of you here. It's quite an honor to be in this conversation with Lloyd Weaver. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So could you hear me before?
Yeah.
Okay. I know how to project. Okay. So again, it's such a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be in this conversation with Lloyd Weaver. I also want to again thank April Silver for having the vision to bring this together. Thank the Center for Black Literature Director Clarence Reynolds, and all of you for coming out and for sharing this special evening with us. And this evening is also part of a pre-event for our National Black Writers Conference, the theme of which is Gathering at the Waters, Healing, Legacy, and Activism in Black Literature. And part of what we wanted to do was to have community conversations around how do we gather at the water, how do we talk about race, how do we talk about legacy, how do we talk about activism. Celebrating the bicentennial of Frederick Douglass is certainly one way to do that, and one way to remember the importance of building on the legacy of our ancestors and hearing their stories. So you're going to hear, this is going to be a conversation. I'm not going to have a lot of questions because I want it to be back and forth. So I will begin with Lloyd Weaver by just saying, as the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, why should we know his story?
Okay, so we're going to begin with a question.
Oh, how would you like to begin?
I'd like to begin by thanking everybody
Okay.
for coming out
Okay.
this night, for thanking MedgarEversCollege, for thanking Clarence Reynolds, and that stirring introduction her boy, really given me a challenge, and for thanking Dr. Green for also facilitating this occasion. I'm a bit stunned by all of this, because, what have I done? And that has been, a big part of my life, is people introducing me in terms of things that I may have done, but then always winding up the introduction with, and he's the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and then, well, what do I say to that? It isn't anything that I did deliberately. And so I'm very pleased and very grateful at this chance to share his honor a little bit, if that's not overstating things. Why should we study and understand the life and times, the character, the commitment of Frederick Douglass? Because he knew where he was, he knew about his descendancy, and he knew how his people got here and how they were being treated. And out of that came a commitment that is so astounding that we so easily and so simply filled this auditorium tonight to talk about it. From what I see in front of me, I would say probably everybody here is an activist in one way or the other, and likely to be very, very serious about their activism, because it means that our lives are devoted to the liberation of our people. Liberation from enslavement, from all kinds of deprivation and cruel treatment that began when the first white man set his foot on the continent of Africa. We're committed to this. We know what it means for our own lives. We know what it means possibly for the lives of our children. So we look for role models. We look for those who have gone before. We look for those who have studied our situation and studied our enemies. We look for those who have developed theories of a liberation battle that we must take up and we must continue. And we look at the times that we're living in right now. And we look for how can we be unified in our thinking and in our understanding. How can we build themes that will assist our struggle? And these were the kinds of challenges that Frederick Douglass faced. And these are the kinds of challenges that scholars have faced, activists have faced, and his family members have mumbled and grumbled to themselves about for many, many years. it was a unique experience growing up in my family, because having an ancestor such as Frederick Douglass is something that gets talked about a lot, all the time. Little stories that don't necessarily get spoken of outside of the family. And yes, there are things that come to my mind every once in a while that my father and others would say every once in a while that to some of you may be informative and may contain seeds of ideas that will help us have a unified strategy of how we will liberate ourselves, that will help us define what we mean by liberation. So even sitting here is a challenge for me because, we don't have a lot of time, but I hope that I do get to say something of some significance that will be carried about. And again, I thank everybody, especially my dear sister, April, who really is the one that put this all together, to my knowledge. So I thank you for being here, and I expect that we will all do well.
Well, thank you for sharing that and building on what Herb Boyd so eloquently laid out, and giving us the context and he also gave us a lot of information that many of us may not even be aware of. But I'd like to continue that by building on why we should know about him and what is it that we can learn about him that we may not know. I know that Anna Mary Douglass, his wife, was the backbone and the financier of Frederick Douglass's work. But she also was not celebrated. Can you share something about her?
I do want to talk a bit about Anna Murray Douglass, but I think we should build to that.
Okay.
Anna Murray Douglass came into her own when she saw Frederick, her future husband, for the first time. But who was this man in the first place? He was born in Talbot County, Maryland. I'm pausing to try to think of the farm that he lived on, Holmes something farm. But Frederick Douglass, one of the first things he knew about himself when he found that he was treated very oddly, even as coming out of his infancy, he found and discovered that he was a child of rape. I'm very hesitant to even say it, let alone to have lived it. So he was a young man that was born angry, without even knowing his own mother. He sympathized with the very idea of motherhood. And as I think all of you know, he saw his mother for the last time when he was 8 years old. And at that point, he had only seen her about 5 times, if that many. And he understood the rumor about who his father was, which was the man that claimed his mother as his own property. And his mother had 4 more children even after him. So you can imagine the horror that she underwent, and the horror of his life, knowing what had happened to his mother. We're almost everybody here black people, so you know how we feel about mothers. Most special people in the world. So he grew up with that as his background, an automatic anger that was even beyond the fact of slavery. And he was determined, among other things, that he was no slave. The people that claimed him as a slave didn't recognize him as a human being, as a person. And he suffered under that as well. And he committed himself to a struggle every day of his life. If you read his writings, very often he refers to those he lived with, to his brothers and sisters. And after he left Maryland and got to New York and then to New Bedford and so forth and so on, he constantly referred to them as the people that he was struggling for. And he found all kinds of ways of getting messages back. He spoke of General Nat Turner, as you probably know. And he spoke to others. He knew where the hotbeds were, where there were likely to be uprising. It's rarely mentioned that he even sent funds to people who he knew would use them towards the liberation of their communities. So he was very much about organization. He was very much about the sense of familyhood that he missed in the traditional use of the term. And so if we look at the essential philosophy that might come from the tactics that he formulated himself, organization was key to it all. That we must be together. We must share our themes. We must understand ourselves as an African community. I had meant to bring something along, and I found when I got here, forgot it. But we all talk about the speech that he made on the 5th of July, about the 4th of July, where he spoke so eloquently and so damningly about the idea that he should consider celebrating the birth of the United States of America. But there was another speech, and I hope there's some way I can get it to you, where he declared with all the fervor that you might imagine that he was not an American, would not under any circumstance be an American, and would be insulted by being called by such a designation. And it was a very, very heavy speech that teaches us so much about who we really are in this country. That despite Crispus Attucks, it's like we're making a lot out of something that was very, very small. That in the founding of this, very founding of this country, we were not included. In fact, we were excluded. That we were not immigrants. We were people who were kidnapped. And the countries we left behind were besieged, and the possibility of them growing in a healthy way was destroyed. And this is who we were in this country and to this country. As Brother Herb has reminded us, slavery wasn't just a Southern experience, it was a Northern experience as well. And constantly, the slave catchers were on Frederick Douglass and his family's neck, chasing them from place to place to place. He ended up in New Bedford, as I'm sure you all know, because he had to run from New York and Brooklyn, because he could not be comfortable here and set up headquarters and function. And that was his wife's real decision. We're getting out of here. We knew the type of man that he was because he was known to stand and fight. In his narrative, he speaks of an incident where he had to knock a white boy out. In the family, they talk about 5 or 6 times they had to undergo that same exercise before they understood. The narratives and other parts of his story are very difficult to follow because he moved so much. But one of the reasons that he moved was that nobody wanted him in the family. And the family had lots of plantations and farms in the Eastern Shore area all the way up to Baltimore. So he was constantly moved in that sense. And as we also know, he ended up at one point in Baltimore, staying with the family of a man called Hugh Auld, whose wife taught him the ABCs. And that was the beginning of it. Was really understanding that he was right. Command of the English language was a requirement. That was his rifle. That was his gun. And when Hugh Auld himself demanded that his wife stop teaching what she thought was a little teddy bear, you know, a game called ABCs, he proceeded to take that and build on it and learn to read to a level of excellence that, okay, we're in an academic situation, that I hope some of us will one day be able to reach.
Can I just stop you for a minute?
Yes, you
Because
can.
you spoke about him being very critical of America and also being very critical of an abolitionist. Of course, we all know he's an abolitionist. But yet he was against the movement they call the colonization movement. He was against moving back to Africa, the whole movement around, okay, well, we're going to solve this problem by relocating free black men and enslaved black men back to Africa. He was against that. Why was he against that?
He immediately saw that that was unwieldy, that it was impractical, and the aspiration for Africans in America to move back to Africa was impractical on a lot of levels, logistically in other ways. What did we own? What did we have? We didn't even have the guns to resist those who wouldn't have wanted us to leave, even though they did wish we would disappear. But he did have a reverence for Africa. We all know, or we should come to know, what the family knows about the root that he always kept in his pocket and took with him everywhere he went. And the family can even tell you what the root was in case you want one yourself. You know, dare to struggle, dare to win, we say. When it comes to Africa, the most important affirmation was after he fled to England, because the man who he last escaped for had bloodhounds dead on his trail, and that was when the family lived in New Bedford. When he was in England and touring Europe, he did get on that boat and cross the Mediterranean to set his foot on African soil, to confirm that he was the descendant of kings and queens. And while there, he did pray for us, pray for his people. His understanding was that African Americans were a new tribe, the African tribe that did not live in Africa. So we in this room are still Africans, not really in exile, but of another kind of nation. So he had no loss in terms of the fact that he wasn't in Africa. His loss was just the fact that his people were enslaved. And that's what he devoted his life from, ridding us of that stigma, of that reality, knowing full well the cruelty that was beset upon people who were designated as being owned by another race of people.
So we're going to come back to this because you ended up going back to Africa. But I want to go back to your talk about his wife. Can you say more about his wife, Anna Murray Douglas?
His wife, Anna, who I've thought about and heard about, I'm trying to figure where to begin with her. She was what they called a free woman at the time. Her family, just 3 months before his birth, had managed to accumulate enough money to manumit themselves, that is, to pay their owner for their freedom. So therefore, in that family, Anna was the first to be born into freedom. But she was still an African woman, which means her life wasn't really that much different than the others around. She may get the job of until he met really the big people in that movement. And of course, the biggest one was William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison is the one that really, really understood that this man could stand on his own, and also could write articles in the Liberator, which was already in existence. And so, in a sense, Anna Murray Douglas was the catalyst for the format of Frederick Douglass activism. At the same time, before, I'm trying to not be too inaccurate, but it was in New Bedford, and I'm probably wrong, so check me out, that she had born 5 children. The last one, Annie, died when she was, I've seen 8 years old and I heard 10 years old. And Douglas was in England by the time that happened. But she was really the backbone of everything, and I like to remember my own Aunt Anne's descriptions of her as she held the lantern and demanded that he stay awake all night writing the speeches that ultimately made him famous. It's like an image in my head. And she never was able to read or write. But they tell me that in her spoken language, she was as literate as anybody else around her. And having worked in the white homes, she was able to make sure that her home was a fitting place for meetings and gatherings and discussions about the strategies of the anti-slave movement. And at that point, she was so sharp and he was so appreciative of her as a revolutionary strategist that she really is the one that planned, because at this point, they were tearing at him as to which way he would go. There were several anti-slavery abolitionist movements going on that were competing for each other at the time. So anyway, he ended up having to run to England. And while there, he lectured all over Europe. I don't think he lectured in Egypt, but anyway, he did touch foot there. And he raised enough money to send money back to the United States, which was used in order to buy his own freedom for $711.66, I think it was.
Just to follow up on that, can you talk about what differences, if any, there were between the kind of abolitionist activities he was involved in and the white abolitionists? Because as you said, he was very much committed to the fact that he was a black man and to Africa. So I imagine that there would have been conflict or differences between the abolitionist activities of him and of the others who were predominantly white, and many also the women's suffrage.
Again, Anna comes in very strongly there, because it was when she returned, when he returned from England, that she let him know that there was a difference, that their causes were not really the same, that the causes of the abolitionists were caught up in all kinds of truly, uniquely American political ideas and conflicts that had little to do with whether or not slavery was a good thing or not. It was really a matter of what is your interest. Frederick Douglass' interest was one and one alone, and that was for the liberation of his people. And his understanding from his experiences had already developed to what she reinforced, and that was black people would have to free themselves, and that's the only way that it would really happen. As I said, when he got back, things were so hot in New Bedford, they had to move to Lynn, Massachusetts. They settled in all right, but she was constantly on his neck that they would have to go off on their own. That the articles that he was writing in the Liberator newspaper sound as though they were written by Garrison himself, and that she did not find that very becoming. Her daughter Rosetta would read everything to her, and she would snort all over the place. And he would sometimes get angry and forget about her extraordinary beauty, and you know, the house would be upside down. So after a while, he relented. By the time he relented, she had already put a down payment on a printing press in Rochester, New York. And I can see my Aunt Ann now. Her hands on her hips talking about that. So she was headstrong. She understood politics. She understood what revolution was. She distrusted the people who she felt were using him for ideals that were not his, and that he was forgetting about the idea that his people were still enslaved and suffering all over this country. Frederick Douglass' big fault was that he thought about his family more than he thought about the nation that he was quickly becoming a leader of. And bit by bit, through the move that began, the North Star newspaper, again, remember, wherever they lived, once they escaped from the South, the home would become a station in the Underground Railroad. People often called her Captain. It became like a nickname. And that was a constant reality. And so it was she that suggested that the new newspaper be called the North Star, because that was an important theme. And we mentioned, and we'll come back to the idea, it is important in political struggle to have a theme that holds people together. You know, very much as we use Black Lives Matter and kind of other themes over time. But these were the sophisticated understandings of this couple and this family. And these are the kinds of things that come up as lessons to be learned as we struggle together to reach out, to follow through on this march towards liberation.
And that's an excellent segue into two things: your own journey back into Africa and the parallels between the Black freedom struggle we have now and the Black freedom struggle now and what the Black freedom struggle was back then.
In both cases, the historical struggle and the present struggle, we have not reached the level of sophistication and maintained it in the way we should have. I'm 76 years old, which means that I was in my mid and late 20s in the 1960s. And I consider that period the height of our struggle so far. What was important during that period was that we were very, very close to a common theme and understanding and a commitment across our nationality to the fact that we were going to fight, as our song says, till freedom was won. And white America saw that and understood where we were going. So it was up to them to strategize how they would stop it, and they did. And there are lessons to be learned that we didn't have back then. As I express it, I refer to the music of the time. It was the time of our struggle. It was the time of Motown as well. If you remember the music, moving on up, keep on pushing, people get ready.
Black Detroit.
Music and everything in our culture. It was the time of the afros that we laugh about now. It was the time when our language changed. I'm black and I'm proud. If you listen to the music of 60s going towards the 70s, the music turned back into just plain pop music. If you listen to the lyrics of the rock and roll or rhythm and blues era of the late 50s and 60s, you will hear poetry like you've never heard it before. And yes, the music stayed beautiful and it stayed popular, but the content, telling us what to do, extolling our virtues if we think about ourselves as a united people. We've not heard that again. And some of us argue about the content of our current contemporary music, particularly rap music, about content, because one or two of our artists are singing and rapping brave and beautiful lyrics. And then most of them, if you listen and you take a sentence, is downright decadent. Decadence is the opposite of revolution.
I would add here that part of the problem is that we don't hear the lyrics of all of those who are more socially and politically conscious. Those are not the ones we're going to hear on the radio station. So while I agree with you that there's negativity, but there's what they call the underground movement that we don't have an opportunity to hear.
And it's an underground movement that is a media movement, and media underground is not bound to be very effective. You asked about my own experience.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I'm a media practitioner. In college, I majored in journalism. That was my practice for most of my life. Before I went to Nigeria, I worked for 12 years at CBS News. Prior to that, I was a member of the Revolutionary Action Movement, and my job was propaganda. If you don't control the machinery, then the machinery is going to overpower you. And that is what has happened again and again and again. We don't get to talk to each other. We don't have forums like this. If we do, maybe before we're finished, half of us have walked away because we don't make a commitment as to what each and every one of us should be doing. And that's what media has to give us. It needs to give us heroes that do things for black people, that measure their day's success by what did I do today for my people. That everything you do, no matter what your job is, your employment is, that we must each have a commitment that every day of our life there must be that input, and that we should be able to trust each other to have the same commitment and to work with that same ethic. That it's not just about a work ethic, it's about a work for black people ethic. And we have to have it because we see what's happening. People call this the age of Trump. It's not the age of Trump. It should be the age of us and our movement. Okay.
So can you follow that up with why you decided to go back to Africa? You were in Nigeria for a while.
All right, I'm going to try to shorten a long story. Since childhood, for whatever reason, spiritual or otherwise, I was enamored with the very word Africa. And I promised that, remember, I grew up in the 50s, the days of the independence struggles. And that would be in the forefront in the news all the time. I lived in Harlem, a place that was alive with the discussion of Africa and the struggles. The heroes and leaders of the African independence movement were my heroes in those days. Ultimately, I decided one day in my life, I would live and work and struggle in Africa with Africans. Maybe I should, I'll get into it anyway. Then I married a lady that had the same commitment. And a lot of people did, it wasn't that unique. I worked at CBS News. There was a correspondent there who was the African correspondent. He talked to African leaders and got a contract to train in Nigeria professionals to work towards the unity of their own country in the way they wrote it. And since I had studied this all of these years, of course, he came to me and said, Lord, you got to be a part of this group. So I went over there to spend a year, leave of absence from CBS, and I came back 35 years later. But it was very, very important because where else could I experiment in the way that I was able with the techniques of creating propaganda in which you could measurably watch people do what you wanted them to do. And those are the secrets that are in real media content, things that we need to learn. And this is a part of what I mean when I say everybody in your job, whatever you do, there is a way that you can work for your people. Nigeria is still a mess, I don't mind saying that. not everybody watches television, probably 5%. But there are theories of how whatever you do in mass media, if you can get your hands on it, will affect thousands and thousands of people who never even saw your program or whatever you were doing. So you got to think about it. But first comes your commitment. What can I do, or will I do, or have I done commitment?
Well, you are carrying on that legacy. As you said, you are an activist.
It's automatic.
Yes, and part of being an activist, you have to learn how do you sustain yourself spiritually, emotionally. How do you keep going? And I'm making that the last question, and then we'll open this up to the audience. How do you sustain yourself in the midst of not the age of Trump, but people like number 45 surrounding us?
Let me say, my friend, it ain't easy, because you don't know when you're affected or how. Look at what we just went through. How many people did or did not watch the NFL this past season? Yeah. Did not, never watch the program. How many of y'all are lying? Seriously, first it's about commitment, and it's about your own intelligence, and it's about your own awareness that we are all constantly under attack from media. All right, I worked in CBS News for 14 years. How and why did that happen? I had a media project in Harlem, but it was funded by a very, very wealthy white person who didn't like what we were writing one day, and the project fell apart. People had seen the work of the magazine, people in the global media industry, and when they knew that their friend had closed the magazine down, I ended up at CBS News with a nice job and a nice salary. While I was there, one of the things that I was doing was studying how do they have this racist output come out every single day. And then I realized it. They were writing what they saw. They were writing what they believed. They were writing what their fathers told them across the table. You could hardly call them liars, because they believed, you know what they believed about you. And that's how they saw it, and that was the language. And I had gone to journalism school, and I would challenge them every once in a while, and they would act like I was just being fussy. And besides, the news comes on at 6 o'clock, let's get back to work. And I was doing my work. So in time, I understood what it is from childhood, for your brain to be soaked with a belief about yourself or a belief about somebody else. That is your output. How do you change that? How do we even change our own attitudes towards ourselves and our people? We are people who, you might say, have been a big failure over the years. That why are we committing crimes and atrocities against each other when someone else is committing worse atrocities against us? It has to be a deliberate process to internally think about how you think, to think about what your real attitude is. Probably most of the people in this room are well-educated. I know a lot of well-educated people. A lot of them work in universities, and a lot of them, their children don't know anything about black people. Nothing.
So we want this to be a community conversation.
That's all
So
it is.
we're going to open it up to you to sustain that. April Silver is going to come back to the stage to take us into this next phase.
We do have a robust round of applause. Like Dr. Green said, we're going to open this up, but we have so many people who are still here. I just want to say a couple of things before I get to your questions. There is a reception that follows this program. It is free, just like there was no admission to come here. There's no admission to partake in some light refreshments. You just have to walk, you know, when we depart, it's right in the room next door. I also want to encourage people and remind people that Herb Boyd's book, it will be on sale right outside as well. Also, if you did not sign the email list, please make sure that we can stay in communication with you so we can let you know about upcoming events and just to keep the information flowing. So on that note, the floor is yours. We're gonna spend some time hearing from you. Any questions? And I would ask, okay, would I call on you if you could just introduce yourself and ask your question? I'll make sure, yeah.
My name is Daria Bermudez. I'm a student at Fordham University, and I know from Queens coming here, and I'm a student interns. I want to say thank you to you, thank you to you all, and thank you to you. Where can I start? So much to narrow it down. In terms of the movement, we discussed, and I won't get too lengthy about these some really typical things about a common ground as Black people we have to have. And so many times I've had arguments, people know me, this roommate know me. I have my ways about being not militant, I wouldn't say militant, but it's very politically charged, energized. Mom's 7 years old. She's right there with you, 1947. You guys came up in that movement. It was a common connection with your people, Black people, not to negate anybody else, but it's really coming down home to us as a people. Whether you are African American from the American South, whether you are Caribbean, American, Black, that was the deal. We've lost that.
And what's your question, sis?
And just a thought, and I guess with that, real quickly, I'm kind of pessimistic about the direction about people. Do you see any kind of forward movement as to what direction effectively our people are going in? Excuse me for that, but that's the question.
Thank you.
I'll speak to you afterwards.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't know about forward movement, but I see a good possibility in the year 2018. America's in a crisis. White people are killing white people. A lot of us are very concerned about that. My concern is that they stop killing us. As our own crisis grows in this year, in which we have an administration that's really helping us a lot, whether we really are not, because we're becoming more and more singularly angry and upset. I'm hoping that everything will push itself together and we find ourselves finally all paying attention to the need for unity of thought and for a determined struggle. It's very important in this time that our leaders, and I mean, I'll ask right now, who are our leaders? Okay, we have no leaders. Yes, we do have leaders, but our leaders are not, we can't imagine them someplace sitting down, talking or strategizing together. We have a great leader there, we have Al Sharpton there, we have Minister Farrakhan over here, we have another one here and there, and the people that are leading the Black Lives Matter. But is there a single theme coming from them? Are they singularly telling us some one thing to do? Remember in the 60s where we were talking at least about freedom now? If nothing else, we had things that we said and shouted together, and those things led to specific actions. It's very important, and I'm hoping that conversations like this are happening in other places where we're demanding that those people who we have accepted as leaders come together and give us a unified movement. It is a time when America is really revealing who they really are. And we should realize who we really are. And it's they who have to tell us the implications of that. what our attitudes, our movements, and our contributions might be together. So the possibility is right in front of us. There's never been a period like this in American history. And we need to see it, even though right now we're just expressing our anger all over the place and not really figuring out what to do. Someone needs to tell us exactly what to do. Our focus should be from the mouths of a genuine leadership, which we have not seen in a very, very long time. So let's hope and look for them and hope they get this message.
Thank you. And just
No,
reminds me alike, you made a comment about the administration. I think we think alike in that department. He's not helping us, but he's helping us. I got your statement.
Okay.
So, thank you. We're gonna acknowledge I think at least one professor brought their students here from MedgarEversCollege. So if the students are still here, I definitely want to encourage you to ask a question. Thank you to the professor or professors that brought their students here. So anyone, I want to be deferential to the students who are here yes, in the back, yes. So introduce yourself. Thank you for coming out.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shana Salam. I'm a student here at Medgar, and Professor Akbar is my professor. Mine is more like, in fact, I'd like to say thank you also for the opportunity to be here. And not too long ago, I didn't know anything about who Frederick Douglass was until Trump made that boo-boo on TV. And I started to wonder, who is he? So I'm learning about him now. But I'm just thinking the media has done such a wonderful job of separating us as black people that we constantly fight with one another, we constantly fight with each other. Do you think that it is actually possible for, maybe if we still had leaders like Malcolm X, who really was teaching us for us to stand up and fight back and knock down those in front of us for us to get where we want to be? Do you think that it's still possible for us to send out the message and have everybody believe, like strongly believe in us as black people, as a majority, for us to stand up and fight back against these people that are trying to keep us down? Do you think it's possible, and how do you think that we can approach that?
Thank you.
It's not only possible, but it's going to happen. I sometimes mention probably the most useful course that I took when I was in college, and that was Sociology 101. And it taught me one simple word, ethnocentrism. That one of the most consistent instincts of human being was to band together in groups. And that's what we do. And that's what we're going to do. Of course, each group will have its own strategy. And one group may think very hard about how to strategize so that its opposite group will not band together. And that's what has happened to us. We are not Americans. It's almost dangerous to say it. I say it with fear. Where did that fear come from? That was somebody else's strategy to make sure that I would be fearful. When I walk out the door, somebody would push me into a car and you won't see me again. Fear just broke when I said that. Frederick Douglass said that. So all we have to do is follow our leaders and be logical. Human beings function in groups. My neighborhood against your neighborhood, my family against yours, my football team against yours, all the way up into nations. W.E.B. Du Bois said, the problem of the 20th century, which is really the problem of mankind, is the problem of the color line, the ultimate group. We came here not as citizens, not as immigrants, but as slaves, admitted. Slavery, because of a conversation, this is what's in the family, between Mr. Douglass and Mr. Lincoln, resulted in the Emancipation Proclamation. They argued. Lincoln sent for Douglass to come and ask him to tone down his rhetoric. by the time Douglas walked out the door, the first draft, the first words that ultimately comprised that document had been written. That's how compelling your ancestor was. It's important to understand that ultimately we're black people and they are white people. They brought us here to work for them. That work is no longer required. So we are what? We are surplus goods. You understand? In disguise. But we are surplus goods. We will come to understand that. And it's becoming more and more clear every day. So the idea of unity, it's at your back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know, okay, I see 4 now. So let's do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yes? Okay. Yes, you're 1, yes. Introduce yourself, please, and keep it, we're on the time schedule? Yes. Okay.
Hi, my name is Carol Jenkins. I work with the Blackstone News and Guerrilla Journalism. You suggested that the underground media is not very effective. I have to partially agree with that. And my question is, how would you suggest that we use propaganda to unite black people? You said that you worked with propaganda in the past.
Yes, I don't understand the question.
How would you use propaganda in media to unite black people?
Okay, good question. I had said that I was a member of some revolutionary organizations way back in the 60s. We're just beginning to talk about that era because revolution is not something that, will make you exactly safe. And so our habits were to protect ourselves. But at that time, we actually had training in how that was done. And there are formulas of how to write anything or write or create anything where from the beginning, you've decided what you want black people, your audience, to do as a result of your communication. And the idea is to write in a formula where you can measurably watch their behavior change to what you want. We need to study those things. I came back in 2015 to the US and I applied to a course at the New School, and I found that there were courses in that. And I also realized there were already courses in that. They were in marketing. How you are made to prefer Pepsi to Coke, whether Pepsi tastes better than Coke or not. The thing is for us to understand ideologically what black people need to do in concert in order to liberate ourselves. First of all, we've got to define liberate ourselves from what? We have to define our condition. Define what we want the world to be like for ourselves in the first place. And then decide what are the behaviors that we need to undertake in order to get where we want to go. And then but you have to have control of media first. While I was in Nigeria, I got to experiment with some of these theories. And I found I was able to help change people's attitudes and behaviors in a lot of ways that made them more healthy as a nation.
Thank you. So we have 2. Yes, brother.
Hello, my name is Mr. Ricky James. I'm an architectural historic preservationalist. I was watching TV at the ending of the Winter Olympics. They showed the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico. What do you think about that Olympics? Okay, also, I'm Letitia James' older brother. I know how you feel about family.
You're whose older brother?
Letitia James.
Public advocate.
The public advocate.
So your
I was away for 35 years.
I know how you feel about family.
So your question is, what does Mr. Weaver think about the 1968
It's
Summer
the
Olympics?
All right, remember the gesture that was made at that Olympics, I'm sure you come was made by people who were already actively in the movement. Now, we're not all stupid. A lot of people have always intelligently approached their lives as black people here. That was a rare instance in which two people came together at the same time and made a decision. And that decision set the world on fire, if you remember.
Thank you very much.
We're still talking about it. It wasn't necessarily followed through on, as it should have been, but we're all remembering it and the meaning of it.
Okay, we had 3. Who's number 3? Yes? And then we have 4, yes, I see you in the back. We're gonna have to wind down a little bit, family, because we have a 8:30 countdown, so I'm gonna try to get to everybody, so just letting you know. Yes, please.
Okay. So, hello, my name is Andrew Cummings. I'm a sophomore here. I'm from MedgarEvers. I was learning from a wonderful professor. So, yeah. I wanted to ask, you know, as a population, you know, as a black culture, before we were unified, but as we have been progressing, I've been noticing that the individual, we focus a lot more on the individual nowadays, and we want to do our own thing. But once we come together, I still feel as though there's the problem of the white man who does not understand the things that his forefathers tell him. You remember you were saying, I'm not sure if it was on CBS, but you were saying that the white man that, I don't remember what it did, but they were, what you were saying, that they were hardly lying. They were telling the truth when they heard what they were saying, because that's what they believed. And my professor, to his point, I remember him reminding me of the allegory of the cave from Plato, how the individuals in the cave were led to darkness and they didn't know about the light outside of the cave. So do you feel as though we should involve the white man in our struggle, tell them what our struggle is so that we can make the new generation of white men a little bit more lenient towards us, to make sure that they're not against us?
Let him ask the question. Let him ask the question. Yes.
Do you feel as though we should tell the white man what is really going on to make them understand our struggle and make sure that they're not still in the darkness about what's actually happening? And if not, and if yes, how?
Thank you.
If I understand your question, it's really not about us telling white people anything. It's really about what we tell ourselves. I remember in the family, being told about Anna when in New Bedford, when her husband was away, and how she would instruct her children how to make sure mattresses and coverings were in place for the people on the Underground Railroad. But there was always an instruction that stood out. Let no one know your secrets. And that's my only answer to that. We took this dialogue, yeah, it's in public. It's very much in public. However, we should know that this conversation is in public and plan for the conversations that will not be in public.
You want to make the uprising without their knowledge.
Well, it's somewhere I can't see your mouse.
Sorry. So you're saying that we don't have to tell them what we're doing in this country?
I don't know why we're preoccupied with them even right now.
Thank you. So we're going to go to the sister, yes, the next person I called her.
Hello, good evening. My name is Jessica Rutland. I more so have a comment than a question. My Professor Ofori, he brought us here, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much. Can I please take a picture with you later? I just wanted to say, your great-grandfather, one of his favorite lines, or his quotes, was, without struggle, there's no progress. So that's basically, you know, what we're gonna go through with this Trump being in president. But anyway, I just wanted to say, and I'm not gonna make it long, you say you're 76, sir? Okay, for y'all that are not black, that's that good black that don't crack, okay, y'all?
So, okay, so you had a comment, not a question, all right. So I'm gonna move forward to, the woman here, and then in the red hat, and I think we're gonna move on to the reception. There will be opportunity, you're in the back, you raising your hand? Okay, so sis, right here, red hat, and then all the way up against the wall.
Thank you.
Good evening.
If I understand your question, is how did I respond?
How did you feel? What was your emotion?
Anger at the condition that he described, and admiration at his ability to get past it and sit down and scheme what was going to be the rest of his life.
Thank you. In the red hat, yes.
Yeah, my name is Carl Dix. I'm a representative. Oh, my, take my hat off.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm off.
I'll do that. I'm a representative of the Revolutionary Communist Party. I'm a co-initiator of Refuse Fascism. And I co-initiated that organization because that dude in the White House is a fascist who's unleashing an assault targeting especially black and brown immigrants. But when he says Africa, Haiti, and El Salvador are asshole countries, he's not just talking about citizenship. He's talking about people. And I was also in Charlottesville, and I had a bunch of his people come up to me and say, we're starting the others for you. This is where they're going. So does this pose a necessary thing of not just being angry about what you're doing, but actually focusing effort to drive this regime out? And I ain't talking here about getting Democrats in, because the solution to our problems is a revolution and getting rid of the system that comes down on us. But is there a necessary phase of acting to drive this regime out? That's what I'm working on. I want to get your perspective on that.
But I didn't see that was you. Thank you for your question.
My only answer to that is I think that that's something that our leaders need to come together and decide what is the strategy to deal with that. It's very important, though, that we all have that reality in mind. It goes back to what I was talking about. Ethnocentrism is a reality. Every once in a while, we get a peek at it. And we get a peek at it, it should be just calmly affirmed, and we get back to work.
Okay, so this is going to be our final question in the stripe in the back. I called on you, so yes.
Hi, my name is Roy Matthews. I just wanted to ask, how would you, or what would you suggest for us to restore familyhood within the black community?
I don't hear what you said. Everybody else is going to have to be very quiet. What?
Restore family.
Familyhood.
We got it. Baba, the question is, what is, in your opinion, how are we going to restore the black family?
I think for the first time I'm pausing. It is because that's probably the most important question we talk about tonight. What we're really talking about is African culture. The idea that we as a family must understand that we-ness here is the center of our lives. And if we really know and love each other, then our ethical positions, we have to concentrate on our own character as individuals. We have to concentrate on raising our children according to values that are consciously and uniquely African in every way. We have to take care of each other. We have to look after our poor and take. I'll give you an example. I have a friend, sister landlady here, who runs something called Peace Health Center. She's an acupuncturist, and there are massage people and yoga people and everybody else that can be there, that can probably heal most of the ailments, or at least contribute to their healing, that we go down to the big hospitals for. The institution exists because of love for black people. And that's the kind of love that each of us, if we have it in our hearts, that we are brothers and sisters, that we are parents, and take care of each other, we will become self-sustaining in a way that you've just never seen it in your lives. The other big issue we have right now is the one that's called gentrification. The fact that we're being scattered. And I consider that right along with the fact that we have lost most of our primary media organizations, especially those that deal with broadcasting, that we must increase our ability to communicate with each other. And those of us that are in charge of systems and means of communication must study the formulas so that every issue of newspaper, every TV program, or whatever that we put out, you know what you want your audience to do or feel as a result of it. You study it and apply it. You measure, did it work or not? That we become scientific in every single way as individuals. This takes character. This takes total commitment. This takes understanding who you are, that we are a nation of people, that is not a joke or something we're just saying, you know, for its political worth.
Thank you. We're going to have to close out this part, but there's a reception, there's a book signing, there's a chance for fellowship. I would encourage you to fill out the survey forms. Please let us stay in communication. When you fill out the forms, you will be added to the email list of the Center for Black Literature, for my communications agency, Akila Work Songs, and for the email list for Barbara Lloyd. So on that note, as we close, can we give Baba Lloyd a standing ovation? So you're welcome to stay and fellowship. We thank you, Baba and Dr. Green. Please stay on the stage. We're going to do a couple of photos. Thank you for coming out.
Can somebody get her story?